Welcome to the Experimental Honesty Podcast. I'm Brian Curtis. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Patrick Corrigan. Pat is a distinguished professor of psychology at the Illinois Institute of Technology and the director of the Honest, Open, Proud program to help eliminate the stigma of mental illness. During our conversation, we talk about our own personal struggles with mental illness, the definition of stigma, 3 different aspects of stigma related to mental illness, including public stigma, self-stigma, and label avoidance, lessons learned from the LGBTQ community related to effectively overcoming stigma and shame, why personal contact is so important to change beliefs about mental illness, the role of language and self-identity in addressing stigma and shame, the stigma surrounding specific mental health diagnoses, including schizophrenia, substance use disorders, and borderline personality disorder, common stereotypes about mental illness, thinking through the pros and cons of whether to disclose your lived experience with mental illness, tools for effectively telling your story if you decide to do so, the importance of relying on evidence to support the use of various psychological treatments for mental health difficulties, and related topics. In addition to the Honest, Open, Proud program's website at www.hopprogram.org, Pat mentions a few peer support resources during our conversation that I'll repeat here in the intro. These include the National Alliance on Mental Illness Peer Support, or NAMI peer-to-peer, at www.nami.org, the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, DBSA, at www.dbsalliance.org, and Faces and Voices of Recovery, or FAVOR, at www.facesandvoicesofrecovery.org. It was truly a pleasure speaking with Pat, and I hope you find this conversation useful. Okay, I'm here with Dr. Patrick Corrigan. So Pat, thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's go ahead and start by talking just a bit about your background. So you wear many hats, and I'm going to list a few of them here. So you're a distinguished professor of psychology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. You're also a licensed clinical psychologist, and you've provided services for individuals with serious mental illness and their families for over 30 years. You're also director of the National Consortium for Stigma and Empowerment. That's the NCSE, which is a collaboration of researchers and advocates from over a dozen different institutions. You're editor of the American Psychological Association's scientific journal, Stigma and Health. You've also authored over 400 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, and you've been either the author or editor of 15 books. And really relevant to our conversation today, you're also the developer and the program director of the Honest, Open, Proud program to help eliminate the stigma of mental illness. So in terms of how you currently talk about, your current work and your ongoing interests, anything that you would modify or add to that list of hats?
I'm also a person with serious mental illness. So I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder. Been struggling with it since college, probably more than 40 years. Took my meds this morning, been hospitalized. Know the shame it is when you stand in line using that one phone on the inpatient unit to call my wife and tell my daughter I won't be at the school function that night. And so stigma is not an abstraction for me. It's a reality. I tend to come at it more by using whatever guns I can amass in terms of research on what works and what does not. But I would say I'm a advocate scientist.
Yeah, and as we'll talk about today, I'm also somebody who has, struggled and continues to struggle with mental illness. It seems like we share generalized anxiety disorder. For me, also chronic insomnia and alcohol use, as I came to later find out, as a way to cope and manage that chronic anxiety and insomnia. So as we'll be talking a lot about stigma today, it'll likely be useful to start by defining what we mean by that word. So I'm curious, do you have, a favorite definition of stigma that you found useful, given your extensive work in this area?
So historically, there's a sociologist in the 1960s named Irving Goffman, who's described what stigma is. He calls it a discrediting label that's attached to individuals. I tend to unpack that more by understanding stigma in three different lights. It is stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination in the same sense that ageism, racism, sexism are all defined by stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. When the public agrees with the stereotype, we call it public stigma, which leads to significant discrimination. Landlords who don't want to rent to people with mental illness, employers that don't want to hire them, teachers that don't want them in the classroom. Self-stigma is what happens to people with mental illness when they internalize themselves and beat themselves up, leading to a decrease in self-esteem. I'm not a worthy person, or decrease in self-efficacy. I can't accomplish my goals. And the why try effect. Why should I try to get a job? I'm not up for it. And then the third one we like to talk about is what we call label avoidance. So stigma is a Greek word for mark. Frequently, we attribute the mark to an outward sign. So if I'm in a room with 100 people and I see people with different skin color and I'm a racist, I can apply racist comments to them. And if I'm sexist and they have different body features, or if I'm ageist and they have gray hair, the stigma is obvious. The stigma of mental illness really is hidden. And the way you get the stigma is it's a label. And the way you get the label is you're seen coming out of a doctor's office. So if I see Brian coming out of a psychiatrist's office, I know he's crazy, and all the stigma would apply to you. And so people want to avoid the label since of all the pernicious effects to it. And it leads to a lot of people not seeking out care when in fact it would be advantageous to them. So the public discriminates against them, the same sort of social sins that people of color and women and the like. Self-stigma is beating yourself up, feeling less of yourself. And label avoidance is avoiding places I can get the label like good healthcare.
Yeah. And so this factor with, mental illness, when we talk about it, it has that almost, that quality of it can be hidden, right? If one chooses to, unless you see me potentially coming out of that psychiatrist's office, it can be something in certain cases, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So let's be clear. People say, I can tell somebody when they're mentally ill or crazy. There are no outside unequivocal signs that people have a mental illness. The homeless guy in the street likely is just poor. Some guy talking to himself, I might call as eccentric. The difference about the label is a label occurs by association. And in American culture, we sort of associate people coming out of the psychiatrist's office as crazy. So the stigma of mental illness is largely hidden. And one metaphor we'll use today is I learn a lot about stigma, not necessarily by examining the lessons of our African American or gay population. Our African American or women. Again, the stigma of them is obvious. I learn a lot by looking at the LGBTQ community. Let me say right now, I am not saying LGBTQ is a mental illness. As a matter of fact, that's probably one of the more harmful things psychiatry ever did. I'm saying the similarity between the two groups is they're fundamentally hidden. In a group of 100, you can't tell necessarily who's LGBTQ, and you can't tell who has a mental illness. And so that hiddenness will come up repeatedly in terms of how to move forward to erase this sort of harm.
Yeah. And so this this notion and this, that it is largely hidden. It's not really obvious just by looking at somebody. This then raises the possibility, well, do we then disclose this? Do we share this with other people? How do we do that? How do we go about thinking about it? And the reason I've been a fan of your work for a really long time now is it's rare to find something where it clearly outlines, a systematic method kind of rooted in evidence, rooted in science for how somebody can go about thinking this through and making that decision for themselves. So in your great book, The Stigma Effect, the Unintended Consequences of Mental Health Campaigns, you say that Honest, Open, Proud, that HOP program, is really the mainstay of your current work to help erase the stigma of mental illness. And so could you give us just an overview of the Honest, Open, Proud program, maybe a bit about its history?
So let's put it in perspective. One thing to keep in mind is I've been a licensed psychologist for 30 years. And when I was coming out of school, we would have told people with mental illness to keep it hidden. Don't share it with people. Don't identify with the illness. People will just mistreat you and you won't get out of it. And really the take-home message for people listening today is secrets are bad. Being in the closet is destructive. And we've done research that shows keeping a secret of mental illness is similar to being in the closet about LGBTQ. It's horrible on your self-esteem. It's horrible on your relationships with other people, which translates to it's horrible on your physical health. So if people disclose, it can have a great benefit on them. One of the things I like to say is in my lifetime, LGBTQ people would have been very hesitant to disclose. And one of the wisest, more fortuitous thing happened is 30, 40, 50 years ago, brave men and women came out. And that really tore down the public stigma. And it really, this whole pride notion, which we're in Pride Month right now, really sort of puts the self-stigma to the side and says you are a person worth esteem and you should be esteemed. And so the parallel is for mental illness is, I've always said there's such an irony to having depression. It's bad enough feeling sad all the time, but on top of that, you should feel ashamed of yourself. And so Honest, Open, Proud was a program we developed probably about 12 years ago with people with lived experience to help them decide if they want to disclose. Let me be clear up front, we're not trying to talk anybody into disclosing. I'm not talking to listeners today saying you should go out and disclose. I'm saying it's a process by which you can decide to disclose and how. So it's 3 lessons done in a small group led by people with lived experience. The first lesson is to consider the pros and cons of coming out. Again, coming out, I mean with mental illness. Which vary, by the way, when we're talking about faith-based communities versus your work versus your extended family. The second lesson is if you decide to come out, you can test people to see whether it's worth coming out. So Brian, you seem to be a nice guy. We work together in the same office. I could take you to Starbucks and I could say, did you see Silver Linings Playbook? It was this movie about this guy with bipolar disorder. What do you think? And if you say, I'm sick and tired of Hollywood showing those guys like that, you're probably not a good person to come out to. And the third is it's absolutely your story. We give people a shot to put their story together. Since everything's done with peers, sort of roll it off peers. Peers can tell you what might work well, what might not. But at the end of the day, it's your story.
Yeah.
Stories evolve. I've been sort of telling my story now. It took a while for me to come out, probably for about 15 years. And it depends who I'm talking to and where I'm at in life and what experiences I've had of how it evolves. But it's my story and people should own it.
Yeah. And so you mentioned a few times there. So this notion of people with lived experience, right? Lived experience of mental illness, and that this is very largely peer driven. And so before we start talking about, the content of those 3 lessons that you just outlined, let's talk maybe a little bit about the unique power of people with lived experience of mental illness, in particular to reduce the stigma of mental illness and also to facilitate the Honest Open program, when that's possible. So why are people with lived experience of mental illness, so important for reducing the stigma of mental illness?
Well, again, let's put it in perspective and compare it to the LGBTQ community. I'm a straight male, but I hugely endorse and support the LGBTQ message, but that message needs to be led by people who are gay. And my role is as an ally. Similarly, the message about the stigma of mental illness needs to be led by people with mental illness. In part, it really addresses the issue of those mentally ill people can't speak for themselves. In part, like all lived experience, I really don't know what it is unless I lived it. And in part, hearing from people themselves, our research shows, is the single biggest way of changing stigma. If you listen to me talk, and you see I'm not drooling and I'm not banging my head against the wall and I'm not seeing things, that challenges your own stereotypes for yourself. So the stigma of mental illness needs to be led by people with mental illness. That's a special message for the mental health community, because in the mental health community, everything tends to be run by doctors. And so if you are a doctor and you're not a person with mental illness, we ask you to recognize yourself as an ally. You are in the back seat. You need to learn from the community of people with lived experience what's the best way to try to change it, and you need to join them in it. The other thing we need to do is we never, ever want to pass the message that you should pass, that you should pretend you're normal, whatever that is. Just as we now realize in hindsight, we would never, ever suggest a gay person pass as normal. Perhaps in their own judgment, they think there might be individual places where that would be wise. But as a policy, we'd never say that. So we'd never say that to a person with mental illness, you need to act normal. Instead, we need to say, we're going to stand in solidarity with you. You are where you are, and I support you as that.
Yeah. And it was really interesting. I mean, in going through your work and the research, it was interesting to me because so much emphasis in my training as a clinical psychologist was put on education, right? If only we explain this, if people understood, and I see you smiling. But so that was really eye-opening for me about the different campaigns we have, whether it's, public service announcements or seeing a certain celebrity come out with their difficulties with mental illness. And just how, when we compare hearing about somebody's lived experience, right, with mental illness versus the education, the numbers, the facts, that was just really eye-opening for me. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, but I really appreciated that in your book and in your research that you do.
I'm just making notes about the sundry things you said. Let me start by education. Westerners, Americans, sort of live for education. We spend the first 16 years of our life in education. I'm a professor, I'm an educator. We sort of feel like you can fix everything by education. And there's some benefit in it. But our first research was the impact of education. Mental illness is a brain disorder, which probably is true. I say probably because there's no unilateral statement about anything. Probably is true. Providing that message to the public does decrease the degree to which you blame them for the mental illness, but also leads to thinking they're not going to get better. You're wired in, you look good now, but you could flip out in any minute.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that's going to lead a landlord to not renting to you or an employer to not hiring you. So our surprising research, and we did a meta-analysis, and for those of you listening who don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's sort of a statistical procedure to do analysis of all studies in an area. We did a meta-analysis that showed that while education leads to small benefits, contact leads to significantly bigger ones. What's contact? Contact is meeting a person with mental illness and talking to them as peers and listening to their stories. And so we really think contact is the better way to go. One thing you said is famous people is so a lot of famous people have come out. And there is some small benefit to that. It's sort of a call to the rest of the world that you should come out of the closet. But famous people coming out leads to what we would call the Thurgood Marshall effect. He was the first African-American Supreme Court judge, and when he became judge, progressives thought that'll really change white opinions about blacks. And it doesn't work that way. You tend to look at him and people say he's not like other black people. And so John Nash, the Nobel laureate who was at Princeton and has schizoaffective disorder, attitudes about him don't translate to everybody else well, because you say he's not like other people with mental illness. I mean, he got a Nobel Prize. He's not like anybody. And so it's the degree to which the average person, the person you sit next to in the synagogue or temple, or the person you work next to, or the person in the extended family, the degree to which they come out and tell their story is the big secret to changing public stigma.
Yeah, that's great. It was just really eye-opening to read that, and then the implications for that moving forward, right, as we talk about mental illness. And so let's go ahead now and just we'll shift into the content of the lesson. So you mentioned there's 3 lessons in the Honest, Open, Proud program. There's a booster session as well after that. The first one is titled, Considering the Pros and the Cons of Disclosing. And there's a number of tasks in each lesson. The first task in lesson 1 is to have, people consider whether they identify as a person with mental illness. Okay. So you and I, we're both clinical psychologists, and, we've both been public about our lived experiences with mental illness. We can call them mental health difficulties, however we choose to talk about that, and that can be important. But maybe let's talk a little bit about why words can be really important when we're talking about stigma. And maybe we can also chat a bit about, to the extent, whether each of us actually identify with that term, that label of mental illness.
If I might detour for 1 minute, and this is not meant as a commercial, all of this can be downloaded for free at www.hopprogram.org, and somewhere along the line I'll share my email address, and if you have questions you can email me. As I said, I'm an advocate as much as anything else, and we can brainstorm how you might use it. Language, so it might surprise you on my view of language. And yes, it's clear language hurts. I will challenge you all to listen to this recording and see if I don't use person first language, because I try my best. We pretty much say you don't talk about you definitely don't talk about schizo or a manic depression. You don't talk about a psychiatric patient, you talk about a person with mental health challenges. The issue is whether we should be wiser about the words we choose. There is a movement somewhere in the United States, in fact, or somewhere in the world, in fact, I just reviewed a paper on this, about changing the word schizophrenia to Bleuler's syndrome.
Right.
And so, test question for everybody who remembers who Corrigan Bleuler is. He was a Swedish psychiatrist, was the first person to develop the basic elements of schizophrenia. And so just as we allegedly decreased the stigma of dementia by calling it Alzheimer's disease, or another trivia question, we decreased the stigma of leprosy by calling it Hansen's disease. Will we change the stigma of schizophrenia by calling it Bleuler's syndrome? I'm not so sure. I think what people learned at the end of the day is whether you call it schizophrenia, psychosis, or Bleuler's syndrome, you're still nuts and dangerous, and I don't want you to be around me. The problem is rarely are there groups who have a single word that is universally accepted as stigmatizing. The N word is clearly an example. The MR word, actually by legislation, going from MR to intellectual disability, is probably the example. And I suppose you can go to different ethnic groups and talk about examples. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I'm not sure there is an example for mental illness. I say this because last week I was doing a webinar and somebody sent me an email and said he was offended by it. And I said, I respect that. But the best example is I was working with a group in Denver, and they were getting together for about 4 times before I got there, and they were still fighting amongst each other, and whether they were a group for mental health challenges, mental illness, mental recovery, whatever. And another example is I was speaking to a NAMI meeting, and I talked about mental health challenges, and afterwards somebody came up and buttonholed me and said she was offended by that because she has a mental illness. So the manual gets around it by asking people what labels work for them, and we then respect that. I come from a very blue-collar family. My father and brother were working people, and we just talk to people about people with mental illness as nuts. And that's sort of the way I refer to myself. I understand that can be disrespectful to other people, and I would not do that. But the other thing about this is detouring into a battle about what the appropriate words are.
Yeah.
Again, the N word is not a battle. That's low-hanging fruit. I mean, it may have taken some time for white people to get it, but that's totally unacceptable. But the detour is a problem because we don't want to spend all our time fighting on the words, because you only get 1 or 2 shots at changing public stigma. And you don't want to detour them into saying Bloiler syndrome, huh? I mean, you'll just miss your chance. As a matter of fact, we talk about word police. We wrote a paper about word police. And you really want to avoid this tut-tut sort of thing if you're using the wrong word, because we're trying to be allies to promote empowerment over stigma. And I just feel like it can derail the discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe in either one of your interviews or one of your writings, this can be in a lot of the ways when we argue so much about the terms and the words and what to say, it's almost preaching to the choir in certain situations. We're talking to people who may already be advocates, we're very worried about it, but to the actual people, we're hoping that we're changing their views on stigma, we're changing their beliefs. Much more useful with the limited time we have to talk about those lived experiences and maybe to disconfirm experientially, right, those beliefs.
I definitely agree with the second part, experientially. You're talking to the average person who works a 40-hour week and maybe goes to school, and they don't live this sort of stuff, and they don't understand the nuance. In terms of speaking the choir, at least in terms of words, that makes it sound easier than you'd be surprised. I mean, I generally don't like to go down that path because a lot of people have some very strong feelings that have been based over time that are accepted by other people with strong feelings. And I just choose to help I choose to accept what everybody wants to use for calling themselves. And that's what Hop does in the first lesson.
Yeah. And I think more to clarify there, the preaching to the choir is oftentimes these conversations are had amongst, let's say, mental health professionals or people who are very worried about this and get kind of bogged down into the minutia versus, okay, what are we actually doing here? What's the kind of big goal? And let's move towards that. So, yeah.
Right.
And so you mentioned nuts is a word you used to use, to refer to yourself. You still do. Okay. Yeah. So the term mental illness for me, though, in reading your work and prepping to talk to you, I really realized I've never identified with that label personally. I tend to talk about I used to talk about, difficulties or challenges. And I know some people are like, it's not a challenge, it's an illness. And then that shifted to identifying with maybe the term, okay, generalized anxiety. Maybe we'll talk about chronic insomnia. Only recently, and this was the most stigmatizing part for me and a lot of shame, to talk about the alcohol use. And you've talked about substance use and the relationship to mental health as well. But I've even gone away from that now just to more talking about what it's actually like to live with this stuff. Right? Like, what is the experience of, let's say, chronic worry or not being able to sleep? And so it's just been interesting, this progression. It's happened naturally, but your work really caused me to reflect on, well, what do I identify with? What do I believe? And for me, it's more, what is the actual experience? Because people can do something with that, right? If I say, I have a problem with alcohol, that can mean a bunch of things to people. But if I tell the story of how I came to realize, wow, this was really serving a function of reducing this kind of chronic conversation I had, this fundamental inability just to be satisfied with the present moment, and how that was blocking my ability to connect with people. I've really found that really hits on a level where I could never get at it with just a word that people can interpret in any which way. So I don't know if you've had similar experiences of how you talk about your actual experience, but that definitely came up for me as I've read your work.
Well, one of my responses is my reaction to a lot of this is it evolves. So it evolves as I've learned to say this message and I talk to this message. It evolves based on where I am in life. And if at the end of the day, we're fundamentally trying to help people throw out the shame and promote respect, I don't want to detour in anything that's going to lead to shame by saying you used the wrong word.
Yeah.
Just two things to share with people. One is personally where I come at, I like the word mental illness. No, I don't think everybody should say that. I like the word mental illness because it is the stigma of mental illness, not the stigma of mental health. And second, the one I'm really intrigued in is, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, aka SAMHSA, talks about behavioral health challenges. That's the way we group substance use disorders with mental illnesses. And my experience is the rest of the world don't get that at all. Behavioral challenges, you're saying it's just a behavior and I'm causing it. Or the other one that's intriguing is I don't want to be lumped in with those substance users.
That's right.
They're really bad.
Yeah. Well, this comes up, part of, the population I work with, yes, sleep is a specialty, yes, anxiety, but also personality disorders, and in particular, borderline personality disorder. I think you've talked about schizophrenia as being almost like the atom bomb, right? Suicide as well, these kind of topics when we talk about mental illness.
I think borderline is, because borderline is the secret amongst professionals. Borderline is a diagnosis when you and I are talking as psychologists and we think somebody's a pain in the ass. And so it's sort of the hidden language that we have for a way of stigmatizing someone.
Yeah, and it's been interesting. I never thought my career would take that trajectory, but there's a book back here. So part of my training is in dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which is one of, the gold standard treatments. That's right, for borderline personality disorder. And, Marsha Linehan, the treatment developer, she's often said that is one of the worst terms we have. Let's call it emotion dysregulation disorder. Let's talk about really tough to regulate emotion. Yes, there's impulsivity. There's so many things that you can say, but borderline, that term brings up split personality, what's going on. And so we don't want to derail too far, but in my own work too, I don't get a whole lot of flack when I talk about my anxiety or I talk about I really can't get to sleep. A lot of people can identify with that. I do get raised eyebrows when I talk about my use of alcohol and how that was using that to cope with the anxiety. But then when they learn about what I do clinically, yeah, that's fine. You specialize in sleep. But when you start talking about personality disorders and borderline in particular, that's kind of my version of the schizophrenia atom bomb that I've noticed. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, absolutely. And something to remind everybody about, Marsha Linehan is out with her own borderline personality disorder.
That's right.
And again, in the field, in the club, in some ways, I would argue borderline is probably the most stigmatized, putting substance use to the side. Schizophrenia is not your fault, it's genetic. Borderline, you're a handful, and get over it.
Yeah.
I think borderline's really tough.
Yeah. And Marsha eventually coming out with that lived experience and also being trained in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which I know you've written about for Stigma, that has its own thing. But Steve Hayes, he has a TEDx talk talking about his panic disorder and how this led to his shift. And so really even clinicians, especially talking about how their lived experience really informs their work and their approaches, it can be very, very powerful. Yeah. So one of the aspects you mentioned, 3 kind of types of stigma, and one of them that Honest Open Proud really highlights is this problem of self-stigma. Okay, these stereotypes, these prejudices we can have about mental illness, and this then can lead to these negative beliefs and shame. And so you've mentioned a few of them already, but what are some of those in this work that you do, those common prejudices, common stereotypes people tend to have when they learn of somebody with mental illness or they hear that term?
So our research and others have looked at a basic set of stereotypes. To me, any of the stereotypes are open to internalizing, beating yourself up, and self-stigma. These stereotypes, the big one absolutely is that we're dangerous, because if we're dangerous, you're not going to hire us or rent to us, or you're going to feel we could flip at any minute, and therefore you're going to try to protect people. Some of the other ones are you chose to be this way, which as a person with lived experience, I always find a bit ironic. I choose to be in the psych hospital. You're weak. You're incompetent. You're not likely to achieve any life goals. Those tend to be the big ones. Mm-hmm. And all of those are quintessential examples of what a stereotype are. They're wrong. And it's interesting when people hear that, because isn't somebody with schizophrenia incompetent? They can't do anything. Well, that's just a long mistaken notion of schizophrenia and people with any disability and their ability to learn to live with it, push ahead with their goals, and accomplish things.
Yeah.
So self-stigma is when you say, well, everybody with mental illness is incompetent. I have a mental illness, so I must be incompetent. I should be ashamed of myself. And this why try effect. And therefore, why should I try to get a job? Somebody like me is not able to. Or why should I try to build a relationship and get married and have 2.3 children? Somebody like me is not worthy of it. And so self-stigma can be as big a hurdle of therapeutic goals as the symptoms and disabilities themselves.
Yeah. So there's now the first task is what do we identify with? Is it mental illness? Do we actually see ourselves? Yeah, go ahead.
So the other reason we specifically asked the question about identity is when we started doing this, we get a lot of people say, hey, this is not me. I don't have any mental health challenges. And so the rest of the program tend to be irrelevant. I'm not gay. Well, if you're not gay, then there's probably no need for you to be in a pride program. So this was an attempt to get people to think about whether they're in a group. And both gay people and people with mental illness, this original denial can be a big thing. Now, we're definitely not trying, I think denial is such a pernicious idea too, because the minute you deny, I'm supposed to beat you over the head with therapy to get you to not deny. We're just trying to open the possibility that you see yourself in this group, and that stigma can harm you. And so that's why we do the identity thing.
Yeah. And so once we have a sense of, and let's say we do to a certain level, we say, yes, this is part of me. I have this. Now the second task really looks at, well, let's actually consider the pros and cons of disclosing, and also the pros and cons of maybe not disclosing your lived experience with mental illness. Okay. And you really break it down in the manual too of, let's talk about the short-term, costs, the short-term benefits, and the long-term costs and the long-term benefits. So we're also prompted to think about, what are our goals in disclosing? What do we expect to happen if we do disclose, and when we disclose, and to who we disclose? And so a huge theme of this is, we tend to talk about, are you going to be honest or not? Are you going to be truthful or deceptive? But the complexity here, there's so much gray area. And I just really love, and I want listeners to have these tools when they think about how much can go into kind of thinking this through and preparing for this personal decision. So in your own experience, did you go through like a formal process like this to actually think that through, to go pros and cons, or how did that evolve, for you?
Probably not. I don't know if it was ever a conscious process per se. I have a story, I should come out and say it. It definitely was a process. I sort of fell into the stigma field probably about 25 years ago, and was going out and telling people, you should come out of the closet, you should be proud, you should tell your story. And I hadn't come out of the closet. And so there was some sort of need to be an authentic person here. And so it was never a weighing the pros and cons as much as it was just taking the next step. Probably to me personally, the big lesson is number 3. What are you going to say about yourself? Which again is evolving. That said, the other thing I want to share with the listeners is I don't have one story and use it with everybody. I definitely am different. I worked at a medical school for 15 years, and I'm definitely different when I talk to medical people. Again, the irony might be we're some of the most stigmatizing people there are. And I didn't want medical people to say, well, you're just one of those advocates and dismiss my research. And so I'm more hesitant when I'm doing grand rounds somewhere to talk about that. Otherwise, my favorite audiences and who I talk to a lot are people with lived conditions or government groups trying to promote opportunities for people with lived conditions, lived experience. And so I think for the individual person, there could be some benefit in considering the pros and cons, and that's why we add that.
Yeah. And I'm wondering too, in your work, when you see this, if it's even fallen out in the research, but are there some particularly strong things that people maybe don't naturally think of that might be a con or that might be this kind of benefit? I'm just thinking for the listener, if they're thinking about, do I do this? Yes, they can go to the website, download it. It's totally free. They can look through it. Are there really common pros and cons that you've either seen when you're working in this area that's kind of fallen out of the data?
A couple things to that. First is the manual. You remember the Family Feud survey said, we asked 100 people with lived experience, what are the common ways that reason for you will or won't come out. And so we have a table based on interviews of what we think the most frequent ways are for coming out or not coming out. Another thing implied in what you're saying that I want to be explicit about is the cons are equally important. We don't want to be trivial about this. There can be negative experiences to it. And while at the end of the day, under certain conditions, I think it's a good thing to do, I don't want people to do this lightly. That said, perhaps the one con that surprises me most, to paraphrase a Supreme Court judge, is hard to stop the clanging bell. Yeah. Once you're out, it's hard to go back in. And unfortunately, in subsystems, it's kind of a juicy topic for gossip mill. Mm-hmm. So you need to be prepared when you come out to how people might respond. And in fact, one of the lessons one of the tasks in the second lesson is for you to share your story and have one of the people in the group say sort of nasty things about you so you can try to find out that reaction.
That's right. Yeah, in DBT speak, we would call that like the cope ahead skill, literally putting yourself in that position of what if they're not all smiles, right? What if we get not only a cold shoulder, but hostility, right? And that goes to the notion of testing somebody out, right? Who is this person you're disclosing to? And there's different levels of disclosure, right? Are you just going to be blanket open about this, let's say on a podcast, right? Or a conversation like that, in which case the genie's really out of the bottle? Or is this selective? Do we choose who we tell this to? And then maybe now we're burdened with, let's say, if not a secret, we really have to remember what we said when we said it. And so the pros and cons about how you choose to approach it, which people at which time, all these things can be very, very relevant and very important to reflect on if you have that, the time and the interest to go through that.
I'm actually a pretty liberal guy, but about this, I really encourage people to be conservatives. Mm-hmm. Try it a little bit at a time and see how it's reacted to. And then I don't really care how much other people react to it. I care about how you react to the reaction. Yeah. And do you want to change anything or change anyone or stuff in telling your story?
And that's really, the impetus for people to ask, well, where's the experimental? Why do you call it that, an experimental honesty? It's this exact point, which is this is actually a practice, and this is something that we can have an idea, a hypothesis about how people are going to react. Maybe we've tested out, maybe they're family members, but really getting some information. How are we going to talk about this? What reaction are we getting? And then we kind of now have that in our back pocket. How can we refine? How do we approach this for the next experiment? And we just kind of rinse and repeat until we find this sweet spot, this kind of middle path that's comfortable for us. And importantly, that we can feel maybe potentially authentic. We feel open, but in a way that we acknowledge the implications this can have for friends, family, work, etc. moving forward. Yeah. Yeah. I'll just share. I mean, for me, I didn't do a formal pros and cons, but this all happened when I was in my graduate program, like being trained as a clinical psychologist. And the major cons was, what are my clinical supervisors going to say about my competence? Right. And so alcohol use was the hard one. And that was, I only actually came to that insight in terms of what the function was of that, and to be able to turn down the volume of those worries and to connect. When I finally, after 6 years talking to Megan, my wife, she's like, let's go and see somebody to talk about medication. Okay. I was so damn hesitant with that. And it's that, what is the word? Is it an anosognosia that you read about? Like we actually we're not aware of, our behavior. Like, do we have a mental illness? At that point, I'm learning to diagnose other people, but I can't see, oh, this is generalized anxiety. I actually meet clinical criteria for alcohol use disorder because I'm continuing to do this. And so being able to open up and ask for help, well, Lexapro, okay, escitalopram, 10 milligrams, a low dose. I remember so clearly getting out of the shower after 4 days of using it, and this light bulb moment of like, whoa, that volume was down. And then this is what it feels like when I have 2 drinks, when I'm with my friends or my bandmates, and I can actually be present with them. I'm not telling myself, you need to be studying tomorrow. You have to prep for this. That interview with, Pat's not going to prepare itself. I can just be here. That was a huge deal. And so medication was part of my story too, which lasted for about 4 years. That was while I was learning all these clinical tools. And so now I know I have that. Eventually that's weaned down and I'm just using the skills right now. But I know if I need that in the future, that's also on the menu. But opening up about that was really scary for me. And then I remember it was during a DBT team meeting. And I just asked, that really encourages vulnerability. Like, what would you think about somebody testing the waters? What would you think about, a fellow psychologist or trainee on the team being on medication? And I remember one of the team members just kind of smiled and said, Brian, you're new to this field. You will be amazed at it might be the exception of people who aren't doing something for their mental health. And so it was just so validating, and I appreciated that so much. But my heart was racing. I was really nervous. What is this going to do clinically? But the pros of, I don't want to hide this. I talk about being open. I'm working with people who this is a part of their story. And just like it sounds like for you, you're in this field, it didn't sit well with me that I couldn't just be open and come out about this. And so that's kind of my story in terms of pros and cons. It wasn't formal, but it was in the back of my mind as I was going through it. Yeah.
Well, your experience about talking about meds reminded me of this label of wounded healer. There's a feeling that a lot of mental health professionals are wounded. That for me, I went into it because of my own major mental health challenges, and just as I sought ways to heal other people, so I use that knowledge for myself. So I sort of agree with you. Chances are, if you're in a room with 100 psychologists, vast numbers of psychologists are struggling with their own thing.
Yeah. And the outpouring of it was just interesting. I didn't expect it. But once people heard that from me, them then coming up to me and saying, I thought I was the only one, literally tears in their eyes. Like, what is the name of that med? What skills are you using? And then and just the relationship, the deepening of that connection with these people who I just knew as, colleagues. I had seen them, but now we're connecting on a human level of, wow, you're suffering too. Okay. They weren't public with it, but that was so powerful to me. And that's continued to be the case as people learn about this.
So again, this is why Honest, Open, Proud is a process. And I encourage people who are moved by our upbeat messages not to run right out.
Yes.
And tell people in their class that they have mental health challenges, because there are people there who may turn around and use this against you. And so again, that's sort of why it's a process of testing the waters.
Yeah.
So that, there is stigma out there, and we need to be careful about it so people don't get hurt.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so now let's go to that third lesson. You mentioned telling your story, right? And so the task here is really, well, you can just talk about it, right? But how do you go about building and constructing a very personally meaningful story of your experience with mental illness if you decide to open up and share this with certain people? Okay. Did you have something to say there, it looked like?
So the manual has a worksheet that asks you everything you ever wanted to know. We like to talk about mental illness as on the way down experiences and on the way up experiences. Yeah. So on the way down experiences is your mental illness, and to talk about that. We really encourage people never to end there, because who we are as people is not just on the way down, it's on the way up. And that's the kind of thing that reflects recovery and actually will challenge the stigma both for the public and for yourself. So this is sort of an extensive history of everything. And then we ask people to go edit out anything they just don't want to chat about. Yeah. We really encourage people not to disclose things that are quote unquote not settled in their life. Trauma can especially be in that category. Let's be clear, if you're traumatized and you have a need to share it, I'm not saying suppress it. You just need to remember that things could be triggering and have your antenna up. And if they're triggering you, you may want to back off a little bit or find a sound third person who can give you feedback on it.
Yeah.
So we ask people to edit this big thing down to sort of some version of an elevator speech, and then they give it to each other. And again, the other people in the group are people with lived experiences too, and get feedback from people. We say, somebody else's feedback is not gospel. At the end of the day, it's your story, and chances are it will change, but you might want to listen to how they're saying things are received.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you mentioned this kind of elevator speech, you can really boil it down. There is this worksheet that, consider all these things, making the story personal, a whole bunch of other things to think about. I'm wondering, do you have that elevator speech? I know you've written about it. I've heard you talk about it, especially what was powerful for me is when you talk about that phone call, making it, I'm not going to be home. Like those personal examples that you've had in your own life. You said it kind of switches based on, or you kind of you might adapt it or decide how to tell it, depending on the audience that you have. I'm just curious that you said this is a process. How has that kind of evolved for you in terms of how you tend to talk about it, what you tend to share? You mentioned grand rounds is one thing, maybe a podcast might be another thing. I'm just curious for the listener to know, since you've been doing this for so long, how that process was for you and how that's evolved.
You've narrowed on it. The story with my wife and Elizabeth, my daughter, is probably the key moment in my story. I've only been hospitalized once. Of the many challenges of being hospitalized, I just remember my children were probably about 12 and 14 at the time, coming in and then just being totally wigged out. And so that really made me feel bad. And so that sort of takes it home. I don't know, what do I leave out with medical communities? I'm wondering, I may not anymore. One of the things too is I'm a full professor. I've published a bit. I've written a few books. What can you do to me? And so I've sort of gotten evolved in a place that I really don't keep anything away. I don't really have any personal experiences for me that are in the trauma set. I think you said you read The Stigma Effect. Mm-hmm. That's really kind of full of my experiences related to mental health challenges. So,
yeah,
I just think I try to balance on the way down and with on the way up, and life turned out okay.
And I think we might be similar in this respect, that for me, the kind of center of the bullseye and the key element was not just Megan, my wife. We've been married for 11 years, now, but our 4 kiddos. Yeah. Age 7, 5, 3, 1, really fun during a pandemic, right, to raise those kids. But it was the birth of Ira, our oldest kid, but really putting this into perspective about kind of getting out of my own way and realizing fundamentally this isn't about me anymore. This is really about being well, setting that example for my family and the type of person I want to be. And so using that and all the tools, again, we've talked about medication, these insights that came along the way, but so that's actually led to long-term sobriety, using these skills and really wanting to practice what I teach, right? Other people. But yeah, for me, it was similarly that experience of family and thinking about, how do I want to be remembered? What do I want my kids to say about me if today was the last day? And it well could be. And so that was useful for me. But having, as the listeners reflect on what are those central things that are important and meaningful to them, that can be very motivating, kind of discovering our values and that type of life we really want to live. Yeah. So there's also, okay, the final task I was going to say, we can shift here in a second, but really how to evaluate how disclosure went, but in particular, identifying individuals and potentially identifying other programs for continuing this peer support process, right? And so I'm curious for our listeners to, who might benefit from learning more about, you've already mentioned the website for the HOP program, but possibly other sources of peer support that they may not be aware of in your work in this area. Are there any key, programs, key resources that you would direct listeners to if this is very relevant in their own life?
Yeah, so the program is meant to be kind of short, partly because this is meant to step into somebody's life, give them some stuff, and step out. We do think the next step for a lot of people is, for a lot of people, not for everyone, is some sort of peer support. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We didn't want HOP to be a step for peer support. So we really encourage people to look at what's out there for them. Me personally, National Alliance of Mental Illness has peer support. But one peer support group I like a lot is the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, DBSA. They've been around for about 50 years. Where they sound like they're focused on depression and bipolar disorder, they are. They tend to work for anybody with serious mental illness. It's a peer-led program. It includes lots of stuff, including weekly meetings. Everything went virtual with the pandemic. I think an empirical question I have is, once the pandemic's over, what's going to happen to mental health? In addition, another good one on the substance use side is Faces and Voices of Recovery, FAVOR. They're really self-help with kind of this pro-recovery. They sort of waffle on the abstinence issue, but they're very much wanting to support people where they're at. And so those are 2 self-help groups that are around the country that you could step into if you're looking for that.
Great. And I'll have all this in the show notes in the description with links to everything, including the HOP program there. And so you've mentioned, self-help groups. Here's some resources. You wrote this one thing, in the stigma effect, and we can shift there. This is about more of the treatment side. Okay. When we talk about, mental illness and really doing our work, not only for combating and eliminating stigma, but then what is the step in terms of treatment to move forward? So before kind of shifting there, is there anything else to say about the Honest, Open, Proud program, stigma that we haven't touched on that we'd kind of be remiss not to chat about for the listener?
One of the things people react to is, this don't work for my culture. And we acknowledge that it's probably pretty much a Western view. And so we're willing to work with people to adapt it for their culture. And we come at this humbly. For example, we just finished a project in China. I don't speak Chinese. I'm not Chinese. if we're going to do this, we're going to put together a community-based participatory research program project of Chinese to adapt it for them. And I think I like China in particular because one of their big reactions to this is, where's mom and dad in this whole thing?
Hmm.
Not in the authority way that Westerners might look at it, but in the sense of they're just a natural part of all this. It's sort of like breathing. Why would we leave them out? And so, from a self-determination view, I might not do that as a Western or American, but that's their culture. If that's what they need to do, adapt it.
Great. Yeah, so that cultural competence piece as well and adaptation. And I should mention, you have a version of HOP I know during my internship was at our VA, right? So you have a version for veterans, you have a version, there's multiple versions there. And again, you can look at the website, but yeah, a really commendable job in really expanding this out to include a bunch of different groups there. Okay, so in the stigma effect, you really touch on something that's near and dear to my heart in terms of my training, and that's, okay, how do we actually provide treatment for mental illness that has evidence to support its effectiveness, right? And so to listeners, that might be just so common sense that we don't really need to talk about it. Yeah, we need to be doing treatments that have some evidence that it actually works. But you and I in this area, we very likely know different. And so if you're willing, could you read this section of your book and we can talk about why this is so important?
Research over the last 50 years has led to many strategies that may help people with serious mental illness to accomplish their personal goals. In this light, mental health professionals have called for evidence-based practices to define interventions are in fact effective. Why is a search for evidence-based practices important? The history of mental health treatment is filled with quackery, including but not limited to animal magnetism, bloodletting, trephining. Trephining was this thing they used to do where they drill a hole in your skull. Hydrotherapy, insulin shock therapy, ineffective treatments remaining to this day, including dialysis, vitamin therapy, and therapeutic crystals. There are also interventions that, while not patently egregious, do not show significant benefits for serious mental illness, like Freudian psychoanalysis.
So yeah, when I read that, I thought, time permitting, I just know clinically in my practice and knowing people who have gone into therapy and their view is, oh, well, I went to this person and they were a good listener, right? It was, they talked about the kind of problems I was going through, and it's been 4 years, it's been 5 years. And what I just ask them, well, how's it going from when you went in? I mean, I've been shocked that even sometimes it's, well, I wanted to work on this, but I was really told by my therapist that I've been avoiding this, right? We really need to go here. And they're at some point not better than where they were, but in some cases they actually feel like it's been worse. So I'm just curious your thoughts on the role of evidence-based practice when we talk about treatment in the context of mental illness.
Well, we definitely want to test out things to see if it's going to make a difference. If you're going to a doctor for blood pressure, you don't want them to give you a pill that hasn't been shown to work. And in some ways, psychotherapy is the pill. And so we know there are some approaches that work very well and other approaches that don't. The troubling thing is, how does your average consumer know? In part, I don't think you should be hesitant to ask the person, well, clearly first, you should never have this position where the doctor says we shouldn't talk about that. It's your session, they're your goals. It might be an evolutionary process for you to figure out exactly what your goals are, but there's nothing unreasonable about saying, how does this help me? And they should be able to tell you, and part of that should be based on their sense of being able to translate the evidence into something the average person can understand.
Yeah. I mean, that's very much my stance is, you don't have to, there's one thing when you talk about, well, are they just following a manual? Okay, we're going to go to this session, and there's not the flexibility to kind of adapt all these treatment goals and, what you're hoping to work on. But yeah, being able to say, hey, what does the evidence say about this? Or what is this treatment called even, right? if your provider is stumbling with that or they don't have a response, that to me is a flag of, okay, what are we doing? Let's make sure this is something that's likely to be useful. Again, with the goal of, as I think you mentioned in a few of your writings, it's not just, this is about recovery, okay? The way down, we talk about that, but what is the way up?
And it's defined by you.
That's exactly right.
It's not defined by the therapist. I think the other big aha moment is when I was practicing, I was pretty much cognitive behavioral. I worked in the psychiatry department. I worked with psychiatrists. They would do their best to manage medications. And I do think both of those can be very poignant. Sometimes stigma runs into this anti-psychiatry movement. This view, perhaps with some justification, that psychiatry is just a tool to control people, and so they might be against meds. I can understand that, and I can respect that in other people. However, I don't like broad statements of you shouldn't use meds, because they seem to work for some people. They work for me.
Yeah.
The other big aha experience I had was when I realized cognitive behavior therapy ain't the end all, the beat all.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, there are a lot of things outside the traditional Western way of dealing with things that may have value. You talked about acceptance and commitment therapy, which in large part is borrowed from more of an Eastern way, mindfulness, accepting way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, if you come from cultures where certain directions seem to make sense for you, find people to do it, and then make yourself the scientist. The proof at the end of the day is, are your goals being met? If I might be so simple, do you feel better? And so if you do, great, something's working. If you don't, you might want to talk to your therapist about tweaking it, or you might want to go find another therapist.
Yeah. And that emphasis there on, oh, this is about your own goals. Okay. The thing I love about acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, for short, is its emphasis on not only goals, but on values. Like, what is meaningful? Why is this actually worth it? And sometimes in cognitive behavioral therapy and those interventions, it's about, okay, well, let's work on these symptoms. Let's make sure we get these out of the way. And then we'll talk about living the life you want after those things are kind of, we've addressed those. Whereas also having, well, what would it be like to actually live the life that you want, to be open, to be authentic, but doing that work to actually think about, what do I want? I was never taught that in school. I just wasn't. The difference between values and goals. And so that can be very clarifying. But just like you mentioned with the Honest, Open, Proud program, having the individual be the one who's driving this. This isn't somebody else telling you you should do this. This is what you need to work on. But ensuring that it's coming from you and it's the life you want to live and you're making progress, towards that end.
And where that's really apparent is on the substance use side. Because substance use actually had somewhat of a simple way of understanding it, which is the goal was easy, be abstinent. Don't get me wrong, abstinence is not easy, but that was the goal.
Yeah.
And we came up with the idea of harm reduction. We realize for some people, abstinence is not necessarily the best goal. There are large segments of the world who like their substances. And so maybe the goal is to learn how to live with them relatively simply. That's a very provocative idea in certain communities that serve people with substance use disorders.
Yeah. There's a book back there, Relapse Prevention, right? This kind of, what is that middle path, and not having that black and white either or. Abstinence can work beautifully, right? It really can. I know in my own experience, I've tried the middle path. I've tried a lot of things. And, as I tell Megan, and she knows, sometimes I'm just not to be trusted when it comes to substances, right? But I know that about myself, and it's been a long way to discover that, but that works for me. But that absolutely may not work for any number of our listeners. And so again, finding the solution that works for you, absolutely. Yeah. So is there anything that we haven't touched on that, again, you feel like it'd be incredibly useful for people? You've been incredibly generous with your time. And again, I've been a follower of your work for a really long time, Pat, and I really appreciate you taking the time. But I want to make sure that if there's anything else that has been on your mind or that you're currently interested in that would be useful to give you the time for that.
I think you did a good job. So let me just summarize simply. There's nothing about mental illness to be ashamed of. You shouldn't be ashamed of it. People who try to make you ashamed of it shouldn't. There are ways to learn to beat this stigma. Coming out with it is one way. There are other ways. And that the whole issue needs to be led by people with lived experience. And if you're listening and you're not, you still have a very important role, but it's more of an ally.
Well, so before we end, you mentioned, you might be disclosing that coveted email address at some point, but can you talk a little bit about if listeners, are interested, how they can find more about you, maybe mention again the URL for that Honest, Open, Proud program, and anything else, if listeners are interested, how can we find you?
So my email address is Corrigan, spelled Corrigan, Corrigan at iit.edu. And my students will tell you, if you email me, I'll get back to you in 24 hours. I'm either on a cross-continent flight or I'm dead. So I am very responsive to that. If you want to learn more, I've had the fortune of having a lot of stuff on YouTube. Just Google me on YouTube. I have several websites. The website, though, for Honest, Open, Proud is www.hopprogram.org. All the manuals are on there. You can download them all for free. If you want to talk to me about whether and how we want to roll it out for a community where you're at, email me, and I can hook you up with me or one of the people on my team.
Beautiful. All right. Well, again, Pat, thanks so much for your time today, and really just sincerely thanks for all of the really commendable and life-changing work that you do. It's amazing.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for listening.